first I got to clear up something. Bagpipes are not Celtic. Bagpipes are far beyond the Celtic people. Bagpipes came into Celtic lands long after they were Celtic lands. You know, the Celts. It's essentially it's not even a DNA. It's a language. It was one group that had a certain language and culture, and that language and culture spread as they spread and became. You know, they conquered certain areas and settled certain areas in Europe. But there are other amazing tribes in Europe that had similar cultures. And the bagpipes have only gotten really associated with the Celtic music or Celtic life. It's kind of like what do you call it? It's a commercial device. You know, in the last 50 years, the term Celtic music, it's new. No Irishman would have ever called his music Celtic music, nor would any Scot, nor would any person from Brittany, nor would it would have been Breton music or Irish music or Scottish music. And even with that, it wouldn't be Scottish music. It'd be music from the Hebrides, or it'd be music from Glasgow, or the Borders, or that kind of thing. Everything was similar. It's like language, you know, that you don't. It's the language of a group, and since it's the language, there's certain similarities and commonalities. And the bagpipes, when they probably originated in India and spread westward with various groups in various forms. And so, and yet, there are similarities in their use culturally in all the different countries, in the German countries, in the Latin-speaking countries, and I mean, France alone has 100 kinds of bagpipes, different styles, different that. Italy has hundreds. Every country just has all of these different bagpipes because it's a folk, it's an instrument of the people. It's like songs, you know, that sort of thing. And the new instrument comes in, it gets adopted, like violin. Violin, a lot of these cultures had some sort of bowed instrument. But when the Italians perfected this lovely violin, well, this is a better one than ours. It would go and people would just take it and they'd play it. Bagpipes are the same thing. People found them to be an amazingly evocative, powerful expression of culture, which is one of the reasons they became so popular. But anyway, all of these cultures are digging back, reaching for their roots and bringing them forward. So it's not just going to the past; it's bringing the past into the present, and thus creating the future. You know, and that's what's happening in Galicia. They have lots of these kind of bagpipes. Then people are getting fascinated with the old bagpipes. In Ireland, the same thing. There was something. The Irish bagpipe was a certain way. When it was brought to the United States by all the Irish immigrants, it was kind of made a little louder and brought up in pitch. And that bagpipe went back and became the standard bagpipe in Ireland. And as piping was almost lost, that was revived. And then what was revived even more were the old, lower pitched, deeper voiced, resonant bagpipes that were played slightly differently and rich and all that. And it's the golden age of piping now because we're both interested in innovation and pipers are finding these old instruments. And in Galicia, this is just glorious that this is happening. I just helped a friend of mine do a translation of a book that's going to come out later this year about music for the older bagpipes, and the music is slightly different, and but it's wonderful. And the author Alexander Cadarso, my friend Kano, who's been coming and teaching at Lark in the Morning for the last 15 or 20 years, he has he's really advocating that pipers who play modern bagpipes learn to play these old bagpipes because it's a vibrant part of the history, and it's a slightly different sound, and it doesn't replace the one. It doesn't do because there's always a place for a bagpipe that can play in harmony with another bagpipe, and then there's always, which is beautiful, just beautiful, and it's very moving. And there's the place for the solo piper, because these older instruments it's a solo instrument. You don't make two of them in the same tuning. It's a solo instrument, which is the way they were played for hundreds of years. And it's a magical thing. You know, there was a question here about bagpipe bands. I just want to address that. Talk a little bit about, you know, the history of bagpipes in general in the world. Because they take different forms wherever they are. But in a certain way, in Galicia, it sort of reproduces the history, because there are like the most primitive instruments that were played would have been a shepherd's instrument, just like a little piece of cane or bamboo with a little reed cut in it that somebody played. And they would, in the old days, ancient days, they would play circular breathing. They'd puff out their cheeks, breathe through their nose, and that was popular over the entire ancient world. And then it was an innovation at a certain point to put a bag on instead of using your cheeks because the continuous sound was what they were enjoying. So circular breathing is like this. So I was breathing through my nose, squeezing with my cheeks. So my cheeks became a bag. And the earliest instruments were just like, as I said, a piece of cane with a little slit cut in it. They call that a single beating reed. That's a double reed. That's two pieces of cane together like an oboe reed. But the single reeds, all kinds of little kids' instruments are still made today. Different styles. That would be a mouth-blown thing. Then at some point they'd put it in a simple bag. It would be a little drone or just that one piece. And then different styles. It's funny, today we talk about Galician bagpipes, but there were hundreds of types of bagpipes, very distinct, played in that little area of northwestern Spain. Because basically each town, each little region would have their kind of bagpipe. And it's like, you have an accent. You have a musical accent, you have a linguistic accent, you would have the tradition. It would be held, you'd see somebody, you'd learn to make something from someone, and you'd make it that way. And Galician bagpipes have this interesting history in that there were no bagpipe groups. There was a bagpiper. Usually an area would have a bagpiper, and there'd be mostly he, a few women, and now many women. But the bagpiper would have a drummer or two drummers. It would be his child or her child, or somebody else. But then as the bagpiper grew old and passed it on, that's how that person would then become the drummer, would then become the bagpiper. Often, not always, but so what happened was, as folk culture was squeezed by Franco, essentially, fascism hates indigenous folk culture. It tries to centralize and normalize. It's what it does everywhere. So Franco really was no fan of any kind of traditional music. He wanted whatever happened to Madrid, that should represent all of Spain. Well, Spain has different languages, different cultures. It's a huge melting pot. It's actually not a melting pot. It's a huge diversity of languages, and because like Galician language, for instance, is a separate language. It's more related to Portuguese. It's the parent language in some ways of Portuguese. So it's not a dialect of Spanish. There are dialects, but they're also separate. Catalan is a separate language. It's not, a dialect of Spanish. Anyway, so it's very similar to the bagpipes. So, and what happened was, with all this Galician immigration, we were talking before about how the Galicians, being seafarers, being a very poor province, many of them immigrated to South America. And when they came back, they brought music, they brought, different kinds of instruments. So in the early part of the century, sometimes people had what they called charangas, or little bands that would maybe have a clarinet or an accordion and bagpipe. Well, the bagpipe makers then would have to change the way the bagpipes were tuned, because to make them work with modern tuned instruments. It's a big subject, but basically, the old instruments were not made to play in every possible key. They were made to play in one key, which meant that the intervals of the instrument would be different. It would sound better with a drone, for instance. It have a certain kind of a magical sound to today's standards, if you're used to the kind of intonation that comes from a piano, you'd say, well, that's out of tune. It's out of tune with a piano. It's in tune with itself. You know, the natural world is based on harmonics, and it's in tune with natural harmonics. Pianos are slightly out of tune so that you can play in any key. But our ears have gotten used to this. Well, the old bagpipes were all naturally tuned in a natural manner. In the early 1900s, mid 1900s, bagpipe makers started tuning the bagpipes so they would work with accordions and this. And so then what happened was you could make quartets. You could either make a quartet of, say, two bagpipers who could play with harmonies, which is a wonderful, glorious, very typical Galician sound, or you could play with clarinets or modern instruments in more of a dance band, and they'd play some of the new music that was coming from South America, foxtrots and rumbas, and that's a great part of the Galician, experience now. And you can say, well, that's not really Galician. Well, Galician music has, from time immemorial, the Gaelic tribes had music. The Visigoths came in, they added their music. The Swabians came in, they added their music. The Arabs came in, the Berbers came in, they added their music. Then when Santiago became this pilgrimage site, people came from all over Europe adding influences. So it was all made Galician, in that same way of the quote we talked about before. I think it touches the soul, incorporates, and becomes the current incarnation of this eternal thing. So anyway, what's happening now is you have these. When Franco died, all the bagpipe makers got together and said, let's standardize a little bit so that we can really make this a popular instrument. So they came up with ideas. It's still not totally tempered, in the piano scale, but it's close enough. It had to be a little bit out on certain tones to work with drones. But still, that was the standard scale they all came up with. And they made these bagpipes, and they were so, again, gentle and loving with each other. They said, we'll make all of the, this is called a mouth or a bucho, which is where you put the chanter in. We'll make all those, let's standardize that. So if somebody wants to buy a chanter from someone else and use it, they will all fit in the bagpipes. So you can, just very sweet. Anyway, and practical. Well, people after Franco, feeling their culture constrained so much, there was this explosion of culture, and people tried to reconnect with old sources of music and with all this kind of stuff, and songs, and bagpipes especially was the emblem of Galicia. And so in a country of, I think there's 2.5 million people. It's actually, it's 90,000 pipers and 2.5 million people, so it's 1 in 25 people play the bagpipes, but which is wonderful if you love bagpipes. And if you don't, there are some people who just don't like that sound. I'm fairly convinced that the Scottish bagpipes are insistent and loud, and some people don't like the volume, but I think a lot of people are not used to that natural scale that I was talking about. And so they perceive it as being out of tune, when in fact from a harmonic sense, a physical harmonic sense, when you have a drone instrument, it's more in tune. Like a piano is slightly out of tune. Here, this is a gaita, Galician gaita, and the traditional gaita just had a chanter and one drone. That was the oldest form of it. There are depictions of bagpipes that looked essentially the same as this, going back to the 8th century in Galicia. More common than slightly later, but sorry, Scots, this is 300 years before there's any mention of bagpipes in Scotland. Anyway, but the intonation was really different, and as I said, and there's a movement now. These are the most popular bagpipes in Galicia. But there's a strong movement, because there are still existing some of the old bagpipes, to preserve that before it's lost. And so a lot of makers are making replicas, especially one man named Pablo Carpintero, who's the most amiable genius I've ever met. And I have one of his bagpipes that's a replica of an old style bagpipe with the old intonation. And it's a magical sound. And they have oftentimes, instead of this kind of a drone, they have a little high drone that has a double reed in it. So it's quite, because we want to connect with our past. We do some different kinds of things. We're talking about a little bit about bagpipe bands. There are some large bands in Galicia, for instance, bagpipe bands. And they have these elaborate costumes. Some of them even have kilts. It's a huge controversy. They call those martial gaitas marciales. And the people who make the gaitas marciales, who build those bands, they refer to the rest of the pipers as common gaita players. And there's no love lost really between the two. Some people are just whatever. It's good to have bagpipes and all this. And the bagpipe bands are stirring and they're big and they're all that kind of stuff. They're an invention of the last 40 years. So these guys, they built bagpipes. They had them built with the drones, all three drones over the shoulder. Nowhere in Galician history is that right. It's a Scottish thing. With the drums, the high tension snare drums, never used at all in the whole history of that. So and still, people learn to play bagpipes in these bands. One of the good, supposedly good, they get very precise in their fingering. It's very standardized, as it was in Scotland. Just a digression, in Scotland, by the way, they're reclaiming their history before the English helped them to standardize every bloody thing. So the old expressive ways, the kind of ways that the Scots who took bagpipes to Nova Scotia, to the northern tip of Nova Scotia, Cape Breton Island, they took fiddlers and pipers. And modern Scots have gone there to find what was it like in the old days. What was the music like? And it was wilder and looser, and everybody had their own ornaments. They all sort of sounded the same, but they didn't all do everything exactly the same. So what is happening, it seems like our modern standard world of standardization has imposed that on these ancient instruments, and it's breaking free. It's coming loose. The soul's coming out again. But we're not throwing away the makers today are better than they've ever been. There's advances that are brilliant and are really helping things happen. So I can't badmouth the bands entirely. They've trained a lot of kids who have a lot of great fingers, and they can untrain themselves and play more naturally if they want to. And if not, they can play in those bands, and there's a place for those. Any civilization, really, is almost to the beginning of time, there were pipes mentioned. Babylonia, the golden pipes of Ur. There were pipes of various sizes that were mouth blown with this circular breathing. And you see pictures sometimes on Greek vases of players playing, the Greek version of this was called the aulos, but they would have a leather mask over covering their mouth with a hole for the reeds that you put in, and it would cover the cheeks because some of these pipes took a lot of pressure, and your cheeks would become like Dizzy Gillespie out, so these leather masks would hold it in. And they were very loud, but you needed, every culture had this. The Trojans had it, the Greeks had it, the Romans, when they came in, you couldn't have ceremonies without pipers. But when they say pipers in the beginning, it was these circular breathing pipes, some of them very long, double pipes. In Sardinia to this day, there's an instrument called the laundetus, sometimes referred to as a triple pipe. It's three pipes that's stuck in the mouth that played, and it's the most beautiful virtuosic bagpipe sound. If you hear it, you know it's a bagpipe, but it's not. It's these triple pipes. It's thousands of years old. Well, after the sort of the fall of Rome and the Dark Ages, the bagpipes came in as a modern invention. As you say, people lost the ability to do the circular breathing, except in the Middle East. They've retained it all along.
And the Aborigines.
And Aborigines.
Australia.
And absolutely. And that's an interesting kind of little sidelight. Well, two things. The first one I was going to say is there's an instrument still played in the Basque Country. I have one and play it in a Basque band called an alboka. And it's a double pipe. It looks like the chanter of a primitive Greek or Turkish or Georgian bagpipe. But it's just the chanter and the mouth and a little horn, like a cow horn. And it's played with double breathing. It's one of my most favorite things to play. But it's a remnant of this antique, earlier strata of pipers that then became bagpipers.
Wow.
So again, the deeper you look into this, the aside I was going to make is, because you said in Australia, the Aborigines, in the National Museum in Ireland is one of an example of a Bronze Age iron, or a Bronze Age horn. The one that I saw was about this long, and it has a hole in the side.
Mm-hmm.
Well, these things are amazing, except that until very recently, 20, 25 years ago, nobody knew what they were for, because they said, well, these are obviously musical instruments, but if you put any kind of mouthpiece that we understand into them, they sound terrible. They make no sound at all. They must have been a ritual object. Somebody who was an Australian came in and took a look at it and said, I think it's a didgeridoo. And they got permission, and he tried it out. Boom. It's a perfect didgeridoo. And then basically, then they were able to try. They've dug up about 100 of these of various shapes and various sizes, all around Britain, the Eastern Britain, Eastern Ireland, Western Britain. This whole area of this one culture. Well, all 100 of them are in tune with each other. And when you play any two of them together, you get overtones, just like you do in overtone singing in the Mongolian. It's eerie. Look up. There's a great website. Just look up irishhorns.
Yeah.
.com, I think it is. And there's some albums out. I have a couple of them where they play these, and it's eerie and fantastic. And it has not been explained in any way, shape, or form, other than there was more to that culture than we can possibly imagine. So, the other bagpipe that I have is got this little drone. A lot of the old ones had a little drone here that's got a double reed in it. It's very loud. It's loud as the chanter. These are softer drones. Over the centuries, the Galician bagpipes have had one drone, two drones, sometimes three drones, different configurations, and some of them are higher pitched, some of them are lower pitched, but always with these variations of a natural scale. This is the modern one, so it's less natural. It's more tempered to fit with pianos and modern instruments. Still a little bit natural. But the old ones are more natural, and there's a wonderful movement now that, which is in a country where a lot of people play this instrument. They're also looking, well, what can we make replicas? This guy I mentioned, Pablo Carpintero, genius, is making replicas. He, in his bagpipe collection, has 180 bagpipes from all around Galicia, and from the neighboring province of Asturias that has its own wonderful bagpipe connection, with again a bagpipe that's slightly different than this. And Portugal also, big bagpipe selection down there. So Carpintero has 180 bagpipes, and he's busy perfecting replicas of all the different types of bagpipes to broaden the horizon of this one corner. I think there's a bit of maybe philosophy and wisdom that if you look at any one thing, what is it? You see the world, the universe in a grain of sand. That if you look deeply enough into one thing, you see all things.